Welcome to the AA Podcast, our little corner of the web where we are not afraid to discuss tough questions like,
when did nutrition, health, movement, and stress management become alternative medicine?
Where we embrace challenges in all aspects of life to become healthier and stronger versions of ourselves.
And where food and movement are the best kinds of medicine, and cooking meals at home is a revolutionary act. Welcome back to another episode of the AA Podcast. This is Ashley Olson.
And I'm Andrea Crane.
We are once again excited to have you back for another episode. And it feels like, honestly, Andrea, I was doing this, setting us all up, and I was like, it's been several weeks since we've recorded our last one. I was like, I don't even know if I remember how to do this.
You do. You did. I'm just over here in awe, but you can't see me today because we don't have video. So
yeah, we're having technical issues.
Yeah, no, you just like literally turned into podcast hostess again. And I'm always so impressed with you. So yeah.
Well, we are back after Thanksgiving. I hope you guys all had a wonderful Thanksgiving. We enjoyed some time with family and friends, but it was so nice to be back home. I will not lie. It's just nothing's better than home. It's just so good. Anyway, before we get started, as always, we're going to share our weekly Bible verse. And this week, mine is from 1 Chronicles 16, 8 and 9. And it says, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, call upon his name, make known his deeds among the peoples. Sing to him, sing praises to him, tell of all his wondrous works."
Wow. Okay, so we both went way Old Testament. I am in Exodus 23:25. So I will be reading out of the New King James. "So you shall serve the Lord your God, and he will bless your bread and your water, and I will take sickness away from the midst of you." But what he will not do, friends, is he will not take the gluten out of your bread. So there you go.
He requires an extra step for that.
That's right.
On our end.
That's right.
We actually have to do some work.
It ain't fermentation. So
yeah. Well, with that note, today's episode is all about the ever-growing popular, once again, sourdough. If you don't recall, or if you tend to erase the memories of 3 years ago, we went through a sourdough making craze, and it was fun. Christian actually started our first one back in 2020, and he did awesome. He did all kinds of stuff with it. It was kind of his thing. And then life went about normal, and we just kind of let our sourdough starter die, and just kind of went back to our normal way of life, I guess. And anyway, about probably a couple months ago, my good friend Brittany said that she was going to start a sourdough starter, and I was like, oh my gosh, I totally forgot about it. And then, of course, my phone heard me talking about sourdough, and then therefore I kept getting all these sourdough reels suggestions, and I was like, you know what, I'm going to just go ahead and start it again. And so I can't even remember when I started it. Probably
like
a month and a half to a couple months ago. So I'm about 2 months in and I've been loving it. I'm not a huge baker. I honestly don't love too much time in the kitchen. I like simple things that don't require a lot of effort, and so far the sourdough has been that for me. It's still been fun. And so I've been enjoying it, but we're going to just talk about sourdough because, especially in both of our fields of work, we hear a lot about nutrition or foods, I guess I should say, from clients that they're loving. And we want to kind of break down what sourdough is and what may
okay, what Ashley is really trying to say here is that there's some really stupid rumors going around right now about sourdough, and I'm pretty salty about it, and so I called for this episode.
Yes.
And so we're here to bust some myths.
There you go.
Okay.
Maybe that should be our title. Myth busting sourdough.
That's right.
Um, but
Oh.
Andrea, what is sourdough?
Well, Ashley, you you actually might be better to talk about this than I am because I have been gluten-free for a long, long time, like over a decade now, and so I have not gotten to have sourdough for a very long time. Now that doesn't mean that there isn't some amazing gluten-free sourdough because I actually have some chilling on my countertop right now that I bought from our last farmers market this past weekend. So there certainly is some amazing gluten-free sourdough, but sourdough just kind of as a as a traditional bread and bread making process, it is almost like it's kind of akin to making kombucha. So you know the SCOBY, that's the symbiotic culture of yeast and bacteria. Um, that that is sort of what happens in sourdough. You get this symbiosis between yeast and bacteria, and it's a very natural process that apparently occurs on your countertop. I don't know, I've never done it. But yeah, and maybe you can talk to this whole idea of starters. The starter for the sourdough that I bought at the farmer's market apparently dates back to the 1700s.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, explain what that means.
So, sourdough is naturally leavened bread. So, it doesn't require a commercial yeast to rise, right?
Mm, mhm.
So, you have to have a fermented base in order to make sourdough bread. And there's it's a very simple process. I use a 1-to-1 ratio. So, basically, if I did 50 grams of flour, I would add 50 grams of water. And it's important to do grams when doing your starter just
Mm,
because
mhm.
it's a lot more accurate. But, and same for measuring all foods, grams are going to be most accurate. But doing a 1-to-1 ratio, and what that means is in a bowl, or some people use a mason jar. I don't personally like the mason jar because the mouth of the mason jar is harder to
Mm,
get the sourdough out. So I
mhm.
actually use a snap and what's it called? Snap lid of a Tupperware
Oh, yeah.
bowl.
Mhm.
So I can seal it up um, when it's not um, on the
Is it
counter.
do you is it, airtight? Like, do you need
It is an
airtight?
airtight.
Oh,
So
okay.
when I put my, sourdough on the counter, I don't lock it down. I allow some
Okay,
air
yeah.
to come through. So that allows some of that fermentation process to happen. So when you first start a starter, and this is how I did it, and there's
And you get it from a friend,
tons.
right?
Nope,
Or you
you can
buy
make
it?
it yourself. Nope,
Oh,
you can
okay.
make it yourself.
Okay.
Yeah, it's super easy. Now, if you want an older starter that's had like months or years or even decades or hundreds of years of
Mhm.
like, um, I guess leavening or
Or just that
what's the right
heritage of
fermenting?
yeast. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that heritage of yeast, then you can get it from somebody else, but you can easily start your own. So take a jar or Tupperware bowl or whatever you want to use and do say 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. And then you're going to mix that up. And then for the first week, I like to feed my starter. So what does that mean? So every day, doesn't have to be the same time, just every day, take out about half of the starter in that bowl and you can put it in another jar. This is called your discard. And
Okay.
really, discard is still usable. You can still, there's so many recipes to use discard sourdough, but
Okay. Oh,
you
can you
would.
hear those dogs? Those
Yeah, I
stupid
can, but
dogs.
they're fine.
I'm
It's
sorry.
fine.
Okay.
So then you have your discard in a jar, and I usually put that in a mason jar, but I keep that in an airtight lid on in my fridge, and that can just it's still fermenting. It's just a lot slower process, and you can feed your discard as well,
What do you feed it?
but it's not
Has to be sugar of
flour.
some kind, right?
Nope, it's just flour and water.
Huh. Okay.
Yeah. So the starter on your counter for the first week is fed every day.
Uh-huh.
And I usually do a single serving or single feed. So I usually do about 50 to 100 grams of flour with either 50 to 100 grams of water.
Okay.
And I mix that up, and then I do that every day. So I take out half of the starter and I
Mhm.
add more to the starter. So fresh flour, fresh water to the starter. And
Okay.
every day, but more bubbles start coming
Mm.
about,
Mhm.
and you're starting to see that fermentation process happen.
Right.
And I would say between 3 to 5 days, you'll notice that the sour or the fermentation, those bubbles are pretty solid.
Uh-huh.
And that's when you can that's when it's probably okay to make your first loaf. It's not going to be the best because it hasn't had that time to really ferment.
Where you get that sour taste, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
The
Yeah.
longer you let it ferment, the more sour it's gonna become, right?
Right.
So, but you can start making bread within like just a few days.
Okay. And
And
so
then
that
after
go
oh,
ahead.
well then if you're not wanting to feed your sourdough every day, which I don't, after 7 days of feeding consistently, I'll feed it for one last time and let it sit out on my counter overnight to ferment like normal,
Mhm.
but then I won't even touch it the next day, but I will lock it up and then I'll put it in my fridge. And
Hmm.
your starter will still live fermented and it'll still be good for weeks. You don't have to feed it
Oh,
all the
okay.
time.
Okay.
Now, there is a film that might come over the top of your sourdough, or
Mhm.
there might be like a grayish coloring to it.
Mhm.
And don't fear, that actually doesn't mean it's bad. It actually just is telling you that it's hungry. So that's if you get that when it's
Still
in
kinda
the
gross.
fridge,
Okay.
you can either pour off that gray film or you can mix it back in. I just mix mine back in because I think it helps with that sour taste.
Oh.
And it kind of smells a little vinegary,
Yeah, it should.
but it's not bad. And so if I'm not making a loaf for a week or two, then I will feed my sourdough starter again and then just keep it in the fridge. But you can keep it in the fridge for long time,
Okay.
and it'll
Mhm.
still be good. So, and
Okay.
then when I go to make my bread, so like today, I knew I was going to make it. So last night I fed my sourdough starter because it had been over a week since I had fed it last,
Mhm.
and I fed it last night, allowed it sit on the counter overnight to really ferment, and that thing like doubled in size from
Oh,
just
cool.
last night. And so then this morning when I went to mix my all my ingredients together, it was really nice and bubbly and looked so nice. Um,
Hmm.
um, so yeah, and
I
then
just have visions of Little Shop of Horrors in my head. Just feed me some more coming from the fridge. I
it's
don't know.
it's really not that bad, and it's actually super fun to see. So like I did a little story of me pulling or a video of my starter this morning and how bubbly it was, and then it's kind of
Oh.
like a web of like when you
Uh-huh.
put your spoon in it and then you pull it up, you, it's like ASMR of sourdough.
Okay. Okay.
It just
I
has like that crinkle sound. I don't know,
yeah.
it's like
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, so the I guess the cool thing about that is that you automatically get if you make it yourself, if you make your own starter, then you automatically get your own local strains of yeast and bacteria because they're just kind of in the air.
Yeah,
And that's where they come from. So, okay, so that's cool. All right.
so I hope you have a clean house.
That's right. And no pathogenic strains of yeast, please.
Yeah.
Um, how did she die? Well, sit down.
Exactly. I had made
Okay.
the mistake of not locking down my Tupperware a few weeks ago, and so I pulled it out of
Mm.
the fridge the next morning and was
Oh.
mortified that there was a little mold on the sides of my jar.
Oh, well, yeah.
And so, um,
Yeast
it
will
was
be
not
yeast.
bad. It was not bad, but I just had to basically um, remove the good and
Yeah.
wash my Tupperware out. So,
Okay. All
but it
right.
was all good. And as far as recipes, mine is super simple. I put a link in the show notes for my Pinterest board, which okay, that sounds super
Yeah.
bougie and like, oh my gosh, you're such an influencer. But if you go to it, you're like, yeah, this is like basic 101 Pinterest board status here. So
Mm.
don't be too critical of it. But there is a very simple sourdough recipe for beginners on there, and that's the one I've been following, and I've really liked it. And so for like today, that recipe only makes one loaf, but I wanted to make two, so I just doubled the recipe. So
Okay. Well,
yeah,
that makes
and
sense to me.
yeah, and I've made pancakes, waffles, tortillas. Tortillas are amazing. Pizza crust, and then it was kind of a flop, I will say, and I'm gonna have to try it here in a couple weeks. But I tried making cranberry sourdough for
Oh.
Thanksgiving, and it
Mhm.
had really good taste. But from taking the dough to Kansas, it was not liking
Oh,
Kansas
altitude.
elevation.
Yeah.
And so, and I am not super savvy in the kitchen, so I didn't know necessarily everything that I needed to do to help it rise and be fluffy. So it was pretty dense. Like it was a
Okay.
workout cutting it, but
Yeah.
throw some butter and put it in the microwave
Yeah.
and it tasted great.
Well, that kinda heals everything, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
but there's so many cool recipes, and I think that's what's probably exciting about it is like it's the base is so simple, and then you can make so much from that. Just a simple
Mm.
recipe. And
Mhm.
like Andrea and I was talking about, I like the fact that it's, you know, basically four ingredients: water, starter, flour, and salt to make a loaf. And I just like the simplicity of that, and the fact that I can control those ingredients. So
Right.
yeah,
Right.
I like it. Christian does really good on it. He's not gluten free. He does. I don't know what you would call it. He might just have some sensitivity to some sugars or
Mhm.
uh,
Mhm.
stuff like that. So this doesn't give him heartburn. So
Well, good. Good, and
I
I
know
think
I
that's
know there's a bunch
wonderful.
of yeah, but I think we need to talk too though, because like I have a client that she is definitely gluten free and she's perfected a gluten free sourdough,
Oh, beautiful.
and so she makes amazing loaves. And I think it's important to realize that sourdough, just regular old sourdough made with regular old flour, you might somebody might react better to it, but that does not mean it does not contain gluten still.
Thank you. Thank
And
you.
so
And
we need to
thus
talk about that. So
yes.
passing the torch over to Andrea. Why do you think people are so crazy about it though?
Oh my
Like,
gosh. So
and why do
so
you believe that are having less issues with it?
okay. All right. All right. So the the first 15 minutes of this podcast are going to sound like a basket of puppies compared to the saltiness that I have for this topic. I am so I I just actually I'm frustrated. I'm frustrated. I'm frustrated by the number of people that I have coming to me and saying, I ask them about their diets and I ask them, "Hey, well, what are you eating these days?" Well, I'm gluten free, and then they tell me about the sandwiches that they're eating, and I'm like, okay, so gluten free bread. Well, I mean it's sourdough, and I'm like, well, okay. I thought you were gluten free. Well, yes, I am, but it's sourdough. And so that seems to be a prevailing myth that I am running across literally every week of my life right now. Um, I have a lot of patients struggling with autoimmunity. I have a lot of patients who are like full blown celiac. And these people are out there eating sourdough and they're doing it
Mhm.
with impunity and it's driving me nuts. So,
Now,
yeah.
are these same
Mm.
people are they saying, "Well, I feel so much better eating sourdough"?
Okay, here's the deal. Here's the deal. So, that's kind of a loaded question.
Mhm.
And sometimes the answer is yes, they do. However, and here's where I want to just like break down a little lesson on the differences between some of these gut complaints versus celiac and autoimmunity. So the first thing that I want to explain is what the heck is a FODMAP. So perhaps some of you will harken back to, I don't know, 5-7 years ago, where people were all aghast about FODMAPs and SIBO and small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And everyone, this is kind of what followed. Everybody had yeast there for a few years. Like everybody had yeast, and everybody was testing for yeast, and everybody was overrun with yeast, and everybody was doing candida diets and all this stuff. Well, the next thing to come along that everyone had was SIBO.
Mhm.
And so, and I'm not saying that SIBO doesn't exist, certainly, because I treat it. But not everyone that thought they had SIBO had SIBO. So with the advent of SIBO, people started to get hip to this idea of FODMAPs. So for the uninitiated, FODMAP stands for, it's an acronym, and it stands for fermentable, that's key, fermentable oligosaccharides. And they are, let's see, FOD, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. Okay. So not it's poly, y'all. It's polyols. Okay. So polyols, um, little science humor there for you.
I was gonna say polyols. I'm just kidding.
Oh my gosh.
I was
Okay,
just
so
waiting for you to say oligosaccharides because I was looking at that and I was like, how do you pronounce that word? I got disaccharides
ah,
and monosaccharides.
that's right. Yeah. So anyway, saccharide, just as a base, saccharide means sugar. It's a sugar. It's a
Mm,
carbohydrate. So an
okay.
oligosaccharide, just oligo means little. So it's a little sugar. And so
It's the
it's
baby sugar.
just a little sugar that can cause great havoc in your gut.
One might
So
say a spoonful.
that's right. Helps the medicine go down. Yes, and bloats you till next Tuesday. But so
Oh.
it's these fermentable sugars, and that's really the important part about this. It's a fermentable carbohydrate. They're literally chains of sugars, and they're specific ones that your gut bacteria will ferment. Okay, so the human gut has billions of bacteria, and it will ferment these little sugars. All right, and that the product of fermentation is gas. And so it causes distension and bloating. And what goes along with that is pain.
Mhm.
So, people who are FODMAP sensitive really and okay, let's say that they have translocated bacteria. So these are bacteria that are supposed to be in the colon, and because of other problems that they've got digestively and otherwise, the bacteria have translocated now into their small intestine. So there we get SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So now these buggers are way up further than they should be. And so they're creating this gas in the small intestine. And so gas in a small tube like that, it can, as you can imagine, it causes pain when when it dilates the lumen of the intestine like that. It causes pain. So people kind of doubling over after they eat FODMAPs, that is indicative. It can be indicative of SIBO, can be indicative of other things, but that's kind of where this idea of FODMAPs and I can't eat food with these particular saccharides in it. All right, and so you can find lists all over the internet of high FODMAP containing foods. Some of them are things like garlic and onions. They're very high
Mhm.
in very specific FODMAPs. Um, but other foods that are high in FODMAPs are bread and
Mhm.
grain containing things. Okay. So you've got this piece of wheat bread sitting out on the table, and someone who has FODMAP sensitivity, they eat it and they have gut pain. Well, you've got someone with celiac disease right beside them. They eat it and they also have pain. Okay. So, what's happening is that sometimes people who have celiac disease, they also are sensitive to FODMAPs. All right. Now, you take a piece of bread, you eat it, you have celiac disease. All right. You cannot feel the microscopic damage that is happening to the lining of your intestines, all right, due to your autoimmune disease. We can only tell that with an intestinal punch biopsy. In fact, that's the gold standard for celiac diagnosis is an intestinal punch biopsy. So we literally take like a little piece of your small intestine, throw it under a microscope, and look and see the level of, we call it intestinal crypting or damage. You can tell that the lining is just being eaten away. It's being damaged by your own immune cells. All right. So that has nothing to do with FODMAPs. All right. So how do we put together FODMAPs and sourdough? What do these things have to do with each other? Well, sourdough, because remember the process is fermentation. So that sounds like FODMAPs, right? It is. You are literally letting the yeast and bacteria on your counter go ahead and ferment those FODMAPs for you in the sourdough bread, right? In the regular bread, you have to ferment it with your gut bacteria. But in the sourdough bread, it's already done for you.
So
And
that's where
that's
people
why,
are thinking, "Oh, that's why it's
yes,
okay."
that's why I feel better. Okay. But, but uh, gluten is a whole different animal. In fact, FODMAPs and gluten are not even the same type of organic compound. FODMAPs, remember, are sugars. They're little chains of sugars. They're carbohydrates. Gluten is a protein. You don't ferment the protein. Okay. Gluten is a
Mhm.
protein, it's not a carbohydrate. So when people say, well, it's sourdough bread, I'm gluten free, but sourdough doesn't have any gluten in it. Yes, it does. Yes, it
Mhm.
does. It may have um it may have lower concentrations of gluten, but it still has gluten. There's all kinds of breads that have lower concentrations of gluten in it, but it's still gluten. And for someone that has celiac disease, and I'll go further, I've told you guys this before, every single person that I have under my care that has autoimmune disease, the first thing I tell them is, okay, so this is the first day of the rest of your life as a gluten-free person.
Mm.
Okay. So, autoimmune disease, you really need to be off of gluten. And if you're my patient and you're wondering why, we can have this discussion. So, but it it's a pretty in-depth explanation if people want it as to why people without celiac disease but who have other forms of autoimmunity, why do they need to avoid gluten? And I'd be happy to answer that at another time. But suffice it to say, the sourdough that you're eating, you are not getting rid of gluten. And there are so many people out there saying, "Oh, it's so much healthier. It's this, it's that." Well, I don't dispute that. In fact, that's like, okay, the difference between sourdough that you make like Ashley makes, I mean, it's literally fermenting on our countertop. Okay, the difference between that and a loaf of commercially available bread is like the difference between you unwrapping a hungry man and popping it in the stove and or you cooking from scratch something. Okay, the differences are legion, and I am the first to say, yes, this is more nutrient dense, it is better for you. If you can eat gluten and if you are fine with gluten, then by all means, I'd much rather you eat this minimally processed sourdough than to go get a loaf of Wonder Bread at the store. The two are not even
Mhm.
comparable.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's the the thing I think that you said, that I really like that you said it when we were talking earlier is stop working so hard to prove that sourdough is healthier
Yes.
because
Yes.
yeah, because it is healthier, but if you have an
Yeah.
autoimmune or if you have celiac,
Yep.
the bottom line is you cannot have gluten anymore
That's
and
right.
expect your body to heal or
Right.
to function
Right.
how it's supposed to or more optimally. And
Yes.
remember our episode in on autoimmunity is the and you touched about it when you
That's
were just
right.
talking about but the micro how do you say that? The
The microbiome.
micro no, the micro
Mm.
basically the microscope of damage,
Oh, right, right, right. The
the
damage.
microbial
Uh-huh.
damage. I couldn't remember that word. The microbial damage that you're doing with even just a like speck of gluten is
Oh, yes. Yes.
years and months in the making of
Right. Right.
repair.
Yes,
And
and
remember
what I
too
think.
that the damage that you have done to yourself,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
It's not irreversible. It's not reversible. Sorry.
No, not true. Not true.
Oh.
But what I think you're remembering is that that microscopic damage that you are doing in a in someone who has celiac disease, if you have an exposure to gluten, it can take up to 2 years to fix that damage.
Yes,
And
that's
what I
correct.
will say that I think Ashley's referring to is there once autoimmune processes get going, you can reach a point of irreversible damage. It just so happens that celiac disease, the only manifestation of celiac disease that is reversible is in the gut because that lining is designed to turn over and to heal and to repair itself. It's designed to do that.
It'd be
However,
more of like the surface or the
it,
visible
well, there are other
damage.
forms of celiac that and it manifests like there's a condition called dermatitis herpetiformis, and it's an actual manifestation of celiac disease that can show up on the skin. Um,
Mhm.
and there's also a cerebellar form of celiac disease. So when people eat gluten, they get cerebellar disease, which looks like dementia. There is a
Mm.
cerebellar psychosis that also results from a form of celiac disease. So when people say, "Oh, but my belly feels better." Well, okay, but if you have celiac disease, you are doing untold damage to your body by continuing to ingest gluten. It doesn't have anything to do with the fact that you're no longer bloated. You may not feel the attack on your body, but you compound that damage over years and you can't claw it back.
Mhm. Yep.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So the bottom line is if you are celiac or if you have an autoimmune disease,
Mhm.
gluten can no longer be in your diet. So therefore,
Right.
plain old regular sourdough that
Right.
you're seeing on the grams and Pinterest and
Mhm.
YouTube,
Mhm.
that you cannot make just a regular
Right.
sourdough recipe with regular old flour, even though it technically is fermenting prior to entering your system.
Right.
Now, there are, like I said, I have a client that's perfected her gluten free
Mhm.
recipe, but there's also amazing recipes out there that you can use gluten free flour to make a gluten free starter and then
Mhm.
proceed to obviously make gluten free bread with that. Um, from what I've read, because obviously I'm not making mine gluten free, it is more challenging. There is a little bit more science behind it and
Mhm.
kind of
Yeah.
more trial and error with it, but not that does not mean that it's not possible. It just is going to take
Right.
a little bit more effort. So I've linked some good articles in the show notes for some gluten-free or articles that you can take a look at, and they might be a good start for you if you are still
Mhm.
wanting to pursue gluten-free. Sorry, my
Mhm.
dog just dropped her toy.
Ah,
Um,
Raven.
gluten-free recipes. But I think the point that we really wanted to get across in this episode was sourdough with regular flour bread or flour,
Mhm.
bread
Mhm.
flour. is
Mhm.
not gluten
It's
free.
it's not magic. There's no alchemy there. There is
Yeah.
nothing magic going on. There's no voodoo that's taken that gluten out of there. And so my basic point is if you have autoimmunity, if you have celiac disease, um, and you make the decision to eat gluten bread, I'm not mad at you. I'm not mad at you at all.
I'm just
That's
very
your decision.
disappointed.
Just disappointed. Oh my gosh. No, I tell my patients this all the time. Like, I'm never going to be mad at you for decisions that you make. I'm your cruise director. Like, I'm
Yeah.
not your overlord. I am here to give you informed consent, and that's all
Yes.
I want. If you make the
Yeah.
decision to eat the bread that has the gluten, just know that you're doing it. Don't think that you're not eating it because you are.
Yeah. And yeah, it's one of those like one of those things that you see on the internet of
Mm,
I'll send Andrea some videos sometimes of like,
mm.
is this true? Because it just seems so far fetched.
Uh,
And then she'll be like, no, it's not true. This is one of those freaking myths out there. So we are
yeah,
busting the sourdough myths today.
done.
Done. So
Uh,
somebody that doesn't have autoimmune issues, can
yeah.
they be gluten sensitive?
Yes, I mean, potentially there okay, so there is a I hate calling it a disease because that sounds so creepy, but there is a disease. We have codes for different diseases in the medical world. These are called ICD-10 codes. So basically, everything that is a recognized disease state or pathology has its own code, and there is now a code for non celiac gluten sensitivity or NCGS, and that is a recognized disease state. Now, potentially, yes, there could be somebody. I don't know how you would tell though. I honestly don't. If somebody is getting, you know, symptomatic after they eat gluten, then I would kind of lean towards, well, you probably have a FODMAP issue because everything
Mm,
that you eat with gluten in it is going to be loaded with FODMAPs. So you need to tease out, well, is it the gluten or is it the FODMAP? We don't know. Um,
mm.
so it requires some further investigation. Um, if somebody feels better eating, like avoiding gluten, then yeah, could it be a FODMAP sensitivity instead? Yes, it could. But if they feel better not eating gluten, then just stay away from the gluten. Who cares?
I know, but there's just, I mean, I can't say that I don't also have this romanticized idea of enjoying gluten.
Oh, I
Um,
know. I know. But you don't have a problem with it. So eat it.
I don't. Yeah, so I don't. But I can see where people
Yeah.
it's probably another whole episode of like just the mental and the psyche basically portion of changing your diet or changing your habits.
Yeah.
Um
Yeah.
in like kind of wrapping your head around this notion of gluten, staying
Mhm.
gluten free because I mean, gluten is in so much that now you're having to, because you are sick on it, you have to
Mhm.
be super hyper aware with what you're
Yeah.
buying.
Yeah.
And whereas, like, meal prepping and going to the grocery store is already for some this daunting task that they don't, they feel, almost handicapped when they go to the store now because they don't know how to shop gluten free, which I know you can do it like,
Yeah,
with no problem now. It just takes a
yeah.
lot of habit changes
Right. Right. It
and
does. It becomes second nature. And here's the thing. I never I never want to restrict somebody where I don't have to. And
mhm.
so I have tons of people that eat gluten that in my practice, like tons. Um I even have friends that eat gluten, Ashley.
Some
So,
of them
yeah.
are your best friends.
That's right. That's right. Uh-huh.
Mm.
So yeah, it's just it's not a big deal. If you don't have a problem with it, then absolutely eat it. But still, I would implore you, eat good quality foods, you know.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
can eat trashy with gluten, you can eat trashy without gluten.
That
And
was probably the biggest complaint that I had when gluten-free started to become super popular,
yeah,
where they were like, "Oh, well, I'm gluten-free
right.
and I'm doing the gluten-free diet." It's like, "Well, why are
Yeah.
you doing the gluten-free?" "Well, it's supposed to be healthier. Like you're
No.
supposed to lose a lot of weight on it." And it's like,
No.
"No, like if you're not gluten-free, you don't have to be gluten-free."
Right.
Um but also like the stuff, so when it first became popular, gluten-free people had to eat whole sources of food because there
Right.
wasn't ready frozen
Exactly.
meals in the freezers
Yep.
aisle. And now there's just literal crap. I mean, for
Yeah.
goodness sake,
It's garbage.
Oreos are
Yeah.
considered vegan. So like the trash
Mhm.
that you can put in your body still by just going off of like
Mhm.
a sticker label of gluten-free is, you need to be aware of that too. So
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, and that's the biggest thing that I just wanted to get across today is that the protein gluten has nothing to do with sourdough. It's in there. It's always going to be in there. Even if it's in there in lesser quantities, it's still in there. And there's
mhm.
nothing magical about that fermentation process. In fact, the fermentation process is acting on carbohydrate, not on
Mhm.
protein. So, yeah,
As
that's it.
always, you couldn't have said it better, Andrea. So thanks for enlightening us and educating us. And I hope that you guys found this episode helpful and also enlightening on, why it's not a one size fits all. And that's what we
Yep.
always stress too with,
Yeah.
ourselves and our clients, is it's not a one size fits all. If it
Right.
was, then we would be out of jobs.
Oh, yeah. We'd
So
write a book, call it good, and walk away.
exactly. So just make sure that you are informed and you know what is in your foods. And
Hmm.
if you are still wanting to do the sourdough journey, then just make sure, and you are gluten free or celiac, then
Hmm.
explore the options of the gluten free starters and recipes.
Yeah.
But other than that, I think that's all we had for
Yeah.
today. And I hope that you found, like I said, hope you found this episode like great information, because I learned some stuff just talking through it with Andrea. So it
Well,
was
I
pretty fun.
found this episode very cathartic, so I'd like to thank those of you who hung on so that I could.
If it wasn't for your sake, it was for Andrea's sake.
That's right. Thank you. Thank you for hanging in there with me. I had to get this off my chest. I
She
feel
will be sending this to every patient
that's
now
right.
that comes in
That's
and
right.
says this, they're gluten free and eat sourdough.
That's right. I feel so much better. I feel
Love it.
heard. Thank you.
Well, if you have questions for us based on this episode or any of the other episodes that we have posted, please send
Mhm.
us your questions via our email address that is linked in the show notes, or shoot us a message on Instagram. We always are happy to hear from you. But but I think that's all we have for today. So until next time, we will talk to you then.
Bye-bye. The content provided in the AA podcast is intended for informational and educational purposes only. The podcast is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. The information and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute medical advice.